Have you ever frozen in the key moment of making a critical decision? Whether it's in business or in life, it can cost you everything. Commander's Intent will teach and inspire you how to lead with clarity, courage, and purpose. So here's your host, retired Air Force Colonel, fighter pilot, and your leadership mentor, Derek Oaks.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Commander's Intent. I'm Derek Oaks, your host. I'm here with my part-time, sometime host, Rob Powell, a good friend of mine, and we're going to talk about strategy. How are you going about executing your vision, and how are you going about planning for your vision? And we're going to talk a little bit about the definition of strategy, but we're going to talk about Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but we're going to relate it to strategy. 7 Habits of Highly Effective Strategy. Does strategy even matter? And if it does, how do you use it? And how do you use some of Stephen Covey's words, which I think were brilliant when he wrote them some 30-something years ago and helped us define or how to manage our life. I think you'll look at his book a little bit differently from a strategy perspective. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob, because he's the one who came up with this idea of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Strategy and applied Stephen Covey's principles to it. And we're going to go back and forth on really how that is going to make you a better decision maker and make you more effective at managing your life, managing your job. So Rob, why don't you start and talk about how you got to this point and what made you make the correlation between Stephen Covey's ideas and strategy?
Hey, thanks, Derek. I appreciate it. First off, I've been a fan of Stephen Covey since I was in my mid-20s and was trying to figure out how to run my life and make myself productive and be able to handle all the many different facets of my life that I was trying to do as a pilot and as an Air Force officer and as a husband and a father and all of those things. And so I became a fan, read the book a number of times. And then later in my career, when I was a young lieutenant colonel, I attended the Air Force's strategy school in Montgomery, Alabama, and had the chance to spend an entire year doing nothing but reading the works of masters of military strategy and philosophy to try to understand and put these things together. And as I found myself going over and over and over these things, I had this epiphany that, all of these strategists, anybody who's attempting to be a strategist, whether you're a military strategist or a business strategist or whatever, would be well served by the same habits that Stephen Covey asks each one of us to look at our own lives to make ourselves more effective and more productive. So over the years, I've kind of taken that concept and I've helped to, push my understanding of how to utilize his 7 habits, but as a strategist in the military initially, and then later on in my life in organizational theory.
Awesome. Let's just dive right in through the 7 habits, and you can run down Stephen Covey's 7 habits as they relate to strategy.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a quick overview and then we'll dive in on all of them. So, really Stephen Covey's got 7 habits, and the first 3 habits are really kind of internal to you, yourself, or your company. The first one is habit 1 is be proactive. Habit 2 is begin with the end in mind. And habit 3 is put first things first. Those are all kind of internally focused habits. Then his next 3 are externally focused, talking about relationships and collaboration. Habit number 4 is think win-win. Habit number 5 is seek first to understand, then to be understood. And habit 6 is synergize, trying to bring all these things together. And then finally, his last habit, habit 7, is sharpen the saw, which is a key habit. That's one that I've really been into throughout my life and taken that to heart. So with those 7 in mind, we'll just start with number 1, be proactive. That's also known as the habit of choice. And the biggest thing that Stephen Covey tries to help us understand as individuals, and I will say as a strategist, is to understand that we do have a choice, that, everything we do should not be a reaction, that it should be a deliberate choice in how we set out to do whatever it is we're doing. So if it's in your business, how do you set out to handle your business? And one of the great things that I love about this is it really is trying to embed in each person and each company and each organization the idea that you should shift your mindset from your circle of concern, which, may be competitors or your market or what's going on externally from you. And it shifts your focus to your circle of concern, what are your core competencies? How do you innovate? What are your innovations? What do you want your customer experience to be? All of these things is what you can actually touch and focus on and change with your strategy. You can't change the market with your strategy unless, of course, you become, Apple or someone who makes the market. But generally speaking, most companies, most organizations aren't going to try to decide what the market is. But this choice, this idea of being proactive means that you actually can do something in your organization, in your business, that allows you to take ownership of what's in the landscape instead of just reacting to it.
I love that. It made me think of pilot training. I had an instructor, and he said, are you a pilot or are you a passenger? Are you just letting life carry you along, letting the aircraft carry you along, or are you actually in charge of it? Are you the one dictating where that aircraft goes? Are you the one dictating where you take off, where you land, how fast you go, how high you climb? Or do you just let life kind of push you along? I had a kind of a consulting conversation with a client recently, and I said, you're great at coming up with a vision and a strategy, but you suffer from allowing other people to knock you off that vision, where the winds of change and the friction of life becomes your focus instead of this brilliant vision that you put forth. And if you can focus on that vision and not ignore those challenges, because they're going to hit you all the time. They're always going to be there. Somebody's always going to care less about your vision than you, meaning everybody's going to care less about it. And so how do you stay focused on that vision and not let those things detract you? And it's about being proactive. It's saying, in aircraft terminology or pilot terminology, is I have the aircraft, I have the stick.
Right. Well, and I think that's a big thing that I've seen actually in my own personal experience. So I have a son who's 20 years old, and in discussions with him, his approach to life, at least at this point, is essentially, I don't know, whatever happens, it's going to happen. And I've tried to explain to him that, that's a very passive way of going through life. I've likened him to being on a raft in the middle of a river or a stream without any paddles or poles or anything. And he's just kind of floating along, and whatever rapids happen to catch him is what catches him. That's the difference here. This habit of strategy means you actually can do something. You have a choice. You have a raft. You have a paddle in your raft. You have the ability to make changes. And once you understand that, that's the first key, is that, and in a strategy idea, what I would say is strategy is a choice, but I would say it's a choice you have to make. If you do not choose to make a strategy, then you will be at the vagaries of whatever else happens to you in your business.
That's exactly right. And sometimes we think we're making a strategy. Like, I put in an address in my GPS and it gives me a couple rows. And sometimes it'll say 3 different choices, same estimated time of arrival. And I have to make a choice of which route I'm going to take. Am I somebody who likes to drive on the highway, or I'm going to take the back roads, or am I going to go to the area because I love going through stoplights, and so I'm going to take that route? I mean, you have to make it an affirmative decision of where it is you want to go. And then again, is the computer, are the tools around me, are the people around me giving me information, giving me cues that are in line with my strategy, in line with my vision of where I want to go?
Well, and that's really brings you to habit number 2, which is that begin with the end in mind. And that's your definition of vision. It's you have to have a destination before you can actually evaluate the map to see if you're on the right path. If you don't know where you're going, any route will get you there. And this is perfect. This is, as a strategist, what you need to do is you have to have a pretty clear vision statement, mission statement, something that guides all of your strategic decisions. When Stephen Covey, in his book and in all of his media about this habit, he has, and I love this, is one of my favorite parts of the book. He has you imagine that you're at your own funeral and you're listening to all of the people in your life talk about your life and what it meant to them. And this is, your parents and your siblings, your spouse, your children, your coworkers, your colleagues, your peers. And it makes you kind of focus on, what kind of person do I really want to be? Now, it's a little bit of a veneer because it's really, what kind of person do I want to be seen as? But as Stephen Covey says, if you understand how you want to be seen and how you'd like to be remembered, that will help you build the roadmap to get you to be that person. And I would say the same goes for a company. If you don't have any idea what kind of company, what kind of organization that you want to be, if you don't have any clue where you're going, then you're not going to get there. And you obviously can't evaluate using fighter pilot debrief and all of those different tools and techniques that we've talked about. You can't get there from here. And so it's really important for us to understand that we have to know where we're going.
Yeah, in commander's intent, the commander walks into his staff and talks to his team and says, my desired end state, beginning with the end in mind, my desired end state is this. And I'm going to tell you the what and the why of that desired end state. And then you guys figure out the how. And that's the inception of strategy. And that commander sitting down and saying, what is my desired end state? So for the individual or for the organization, what do I want things to look at, end game here?
Yeah, absolutely. And being able to be as explicit as possible in that development of your end state or your commander's intent, being as deliberate about that and as distinct, I think is important. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have all of the details. For example, one of the companies that I've followed for quite a bit of my life is Apple. And Apple didn't set out to be specifically the best computer company in the world. And in fact, the strategy that seems to guide their vision for the most part is we want to make people's lives better. And they've just done that using a variety of technology, starting with, computers and the Mac in the 80s, but, iPods and iPads and, all of the phones and everything that they've done, all is an outgrowth of having that end in mind, that they want to be a company that changes people's lives. And so your strategy doesn't have to be, we're going to be the number one company in the world, within the next 5 years in X industry. It can be something a little more grand, but it should obviously be a vision that you can aspire to and that you can actually achieve at some point.
Yeah, it's like intangibly tangible, if that makes sense. I want to be a better person, or I want to be this kind of a person. It's not necessarily, it's tough to put your finger on, but you can envision it and you can feel it. And it isn't necessarily like a financial goal, although those can be part of what you're talking about, but it's a vision of where you want to be.
Yeah, where do you sit in the ecosystem of organizations, businesses? That brings me kind of to my next habit 3, the put first things first. When I was a commander, squadron commander, this was one of the things that I tried to drive and drill into people's heads quite often, because I think it was the one piece that I could get out in a short period of time that would have the most impact. And the thing that in Covey's book, he uses it, but it's also called the Eisenhower matrix or the urgent important matrix, that teaches you how to kind of put things in their buckets. There are things that are urgent and important, and those are things that you should do and take care of and do them quickly. There are things that are urgent, but not important. Your phone ringing or somebody knocking on your door is urgent, but not necessarily important. And those are things that in the Eisenhower matrix, they teach you to delegate or to, move beyond. The last quadrant is not urgent, not important. And that's a lot of time wasters, whether it's watching too much TV, playing too many video games, what have you. But really the most important is the quadrant 2, important, but not urgent. And my argument that I've made over and over and over again, and I think it stands not just for people, but for organizations, is if you can work most of the time in that quadrant 2, that important, but not urgent, it minimizes your time that you spend in that urgent and important, which is a very stressful place to live as a business or as an organization. Instead, that important and not urgent quadrant is really, really where strategy lives. It's where the people that aren't being hit in the face with whatever is coming at you from a day to day, it allows them to create that vision, to define that strategy, to do the research and development that it takes to move your company into the next level, to do the talent development that allows you to grow and develop better workers, better leaders, and kind of how to develop those long-term relationships. And so to me, putting first things first, understanding how to do those things that are most important to your strategy, your outcome, and your vision is what you should put your time and energy into.
when you talk about putting first things first, if you don't do that, if you don't put first things first, then you often approach things in ways that where your priorities fall by the wayside. I've used this before. I've said this before. Nobody sets out to ruin their family. Nobody gets married and says, now, well, what are the 10 steps, to ruin my relationship with my wife? And yet we do that all the time because we don't prioritize. We don't go about executing a strategy with those priorities first. And if we execute putting those priorities first, then we're able to manage the urgent, we're able to manage the unexpected and the things that we don't want in our lives while we're prioritizing what matters to us. That doesn't mean that we're always going to be able to spend all of our time with our family, spend all of our time with things that really matter to us, because this is not the way the world works. But our approach and our vision and our attitude will be such that we're always going to circle back to what matters most. And we're always going to circle back to those priorities.
Yeah, and the thing that comes to mind when you talk about putting first things first from an aviation perspective as a pilot is one of the first things that I remember being taught in pilot training is, hey, the order of importance and priority of what you do is aviate, navigate, and communicate. In that order. Aviate means keep the airplane, straight and level, keep it wings up, keep it out of the dirt. That's the first things first. Because if you don't do that, nothing else matters. Navigate, point the airplane where you want it to go and make sure it's doing what you want it to do. And then communicate. Finally, talk to air traffic control or controllers outside or whoever it is to make sure that they know what you're doing. But if any of them goes by the wayside, that's it. That's our lives. If we put the first things first, big rocks. And so as an organization, if you take care of the important big rocks first and then let everything else flow into the spaces, we'll be a lot more effective in our strategy.
Focusing on first things first, and then stepping on to the next thing of thinking win-win. Mm-hmm. How does that apply to strategy, and how does that apply to what did Stephen Covey say about it, and how does it matter to strategy?
Well, win-win is an interesting one, especially from a military strategist perspective, because when we think of a military strategy in particular, we think win. How do I get to that victory? How do I defeat the enemy's forces and impose my will upon an enemy? And yet, one of my professors remarked that quite often we get wrong the idea of not thinking win-win in strategy, because we may do everything correct on the battlefield and then lose for winning. The most classic example that I can think of is really World War I and World War II, how the outcome of World War I sowed the seeds for World War II less than a generation later. Because the terms and conditions of the armistice at the end of World War I were particularly onerous upon the German people, which allowed that atmosphere to continue to develop the way that it did, metastasized into Nazi Germany, which ultimately ended up with World War II. The other kind of a great example of that for us is not thinking about winning the peace. And so win-win, that mutual benefit, and it's kind of funny when you talk about mutual benefit from a military strategy, but if you don't think about how that works with your strategy, how am I going to get to a stasis? We can't always be in conflict. How do we get to something that's going to be mutually beneficial so that we can move on from the hostilities that we're engaged in at this point?
I think of win-win as, am I a zero-sum game kind of a person, or am I a bounty and plenitude kind of a person where there's plenty for everybody, there's plenty of work for everybody, and so many decisions are made when they're thinking, if you win, that means that I'm losing. And that's not true. I mean, sometimes that is true. You can't have two winners of the Super Bowl. You can't have two winners of the World Series for the actual game. But there are so many instances and so many examples where you don't have to look at it as conquering your foe. And so in a company, in an organization, and on the sports field, and so many endeavors, people think of it as a binary equation. But if you win, that means I lose. So I'm not going to let that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a good strategy keeps that in the forefront of its mind, because when you talk about zero-sum games, and so I studied a bit of economics in college, and when you talk about game theory, The way you play games, if you play it one time against a competitor, you may be able to cheat or get away with it or whatever if you're only doing a single game. But if you know this is going to be a game that you're playing over and over and over again, they've shown, through a tremendous amount of research and logic that the best outcome that you get is always to collaborate. We can get farther going ahead. It's kind of what basic macroeconomics is based on, is the fact that somebody else has capabilities that maybe are better than mine that I can be complementary to, and we can move farther and faster ahead. And so if your strategy as a company organization isn't thinking about that win-win, especially outside your company, you're going to get yourself in trouble. But I do want to bring up that there is another aspect, I think, to strategy of win-win in a company that is often neglected by what I see currently going on in the marketplace today. And that is the win-win of your organization and the people that work with and for you. If you don't think about win-win for the person that's in your organization, that you've invested time and energy and money, to hire and to train and to, learn how to do their job. If you don't think about win-win, yes, as a boss, especially as a military boss, I had the ability to order my people to work 7 days a week and 18 hours a day if I needed them to. And I think most of my people, the folks that work for us in the military, they all understood that there were times that needed to happen. But I'm not thinking win-win if that's constantly how I'm using my people. If instead I think about what my people's lives are doing and keep that into account, I think our strategy as an organization is enhanced by that win-win thinking rather than being hobbled.
That's an interesting point. And I think one of the ways we fail as leaders is when we don't ask ourselves, what does winning look like for our coworkers? What does winning look like for the rest of the organization? And you talked about your squadron mates and how you could make them work 7 days a week. And by doing that, you could win that particular battle. You could accomplish whatever mission it was that you were supposed to do. And they're on board for a little while. But if you keep doing that, where you continually win at their expense, because you've never asked what winning looks like for them, then they're going to go, I'm losing here, so I'm going to leave. So instead of thinking of it as win-win, where all of you are able to be successful, then you're going to end up losing in the long run. And because they're not winning, you have to know what winning looks like for them. You have to know what they want out of life.
Yeah, and it is a strategic imperative to me, because I saw this in the military quite often. Is squadron commanders or leaders, CEOs of organizations were in place for about 2 years. And it seemed like if you were in a unit for longer than 2 years, every new leader that would come in would have the same, okay, guys, we're doing pretty good, but man, if you'll just give me 12 months of really hard work, we can get where we need to be. And you'd, go to work, put your shoulder to the wheel and nose to the grindstone, and you'd work. And, 12 to 18 months into this guy's tenure, okay, yeah, things are going pretty good. And then 6 months later, he leaves. The new guy comes in and, if you'll just put your shoulder to the wheel and nose to the grindstone, well, pretty soon you find yourself that I've just been working my can off for, 4 or 5 years. And that leader hasn't thought any lick about the fact that this unit has been running at 98% capacity for 5 years. They're just trying to get it done in their time frame. And I think that's an important piece of building strategy is, how do you get win-win external to the company and internally with your own people?
I think about one challenge I had as a military commander, and I saw it over and over. I saw it done well, and I saw it done very poorly sometimes. And that's the management of weapons officers. A young kid would go to weapons school, and they normally go to weapons school at anywhere between the 6 and 8 year point as an officer and as a pilot, in my case. And a lot of people expected them to come out of weapons school and literally go through about a 2-year sprint where they are working 6 days a week, 12, 14-hour days every single day, and they're completely all in during that period of time. And the problem with that would work for some, but the problem with that, and I saw it over and over again, where a weapons officer, he would serve his 2 years as a weapons officer, and guess what? He's at the end of his commitment, when at the end of the 2 years, he could get out of the Air Force. And a lot of them went, I haven't seen my wife in 2 years. I haven't seen my kids. I missed all these different things. And I can't continue at this pace, because we'd call them 2-year sprint, but then we'd send them back to weapons school to be weapons school instructors, where again, it's a 5-month sprint followed by a little time off, then another 5-month sprint. And it was very, very challenging.
Yeah.
And a lot of great people said, I need some work-life balance. I need to win in other aspects of my life besides just that. And so I saw that a number of times, and I made a concerted effort to make that not the case. I want this guy, I want him to win personally for 20 plus years. I want him to stay in, because the Air Force, we just invested a ton of money to train him to be literally the best at his game and the best in his field. I don't want him to get out at the 10-year point and go to the airlines or go and do something else. I want him to stay in for a full 20 years, because I need him to not be just a weapons officer. I need him then to be a weapons officer instructor and a commander and a staff officer and so much more. And the same thing happens in so many organizations where we're trying to squeeze blood out of a turnip by getting as much as we can out of an individual or out of a resource in a short amount of time when it matters to us, instead of looking at what winning looks like for them.
Well, and that leads straight into the fifth habit: seek first to understand and then to be understood.
Yeah.
And that's really trying to understand what's going on in your strategy inside your organization. But just as important to that is understanding what is going on externally. You have to understand what role you're playing in a marketplace. Where is your market, really? And understanding what your customers want, what your competitors are doing, what the overall market is doing. This is one where I think a lot of people get stuck in strategy by saying, well, this is just reacting to the market. And again, we go back to habit one. No, it's a proactive choice. It's a choice to look and do those deep dives, to look at the market and to set up those tripwires to help you understand, hey, when do I need to adjust my strategy or my operations in order to be competitive in the environment that we're looking at? One of the great classic examples of this is Kodak. You know, Kodak for years and years was the leader in making film products for cameras. And literally almost overnight, the entire market shifted beneath their feet when digital cameras became, the new thing. And Kodak found itself kind of at a crossroads, but they had to understand two things. One, they had to understand what kind of company they were, and they had to understand where that industry was going. And I think they did a pretty good job at the time of pivoting away from film and film development and going into digital cameras and printing to be able to continue to be a leader in that industry.
If you don't understand what's going on around you, then you may have a misapplication of your efforts. You see this in conversation all the time, where you're listening to other people so that you can respond to them and so that you can have a rebuttal, instead of actually listening to understand what they are saying. And the same goes with the market. If you have a predetermined notion of what's right and wrong or what you want to do, then you're not listening to understand. You're not listening to learn. You're listening to rebut it, and you're listening to move the conversation forward in the direction you want it to move forward, right, instead of in the direction where it should move forward.
Well, yeah, and this listening to the market and listening to customers, it's pretty amazing. I mentioned Apple earlier. I'll come back to them again because I've had the opportunity to listen to some of their leadership talk about the way they designed some of the technology they'd come up with. And some of this was listening to people, listening to what they wanted and what they needed in their lives to make their lives better. And some of this also was just understanding what their competitors were doing, and not just what they were doing, what their competitors were making effectively, and not just what they were doing. And another great example of listening and trying to understand, I think, and time will only tell if I'm right on this one, is watching what Southwest Airlines has done over the last, 18 months to 2 years. What it appears, at least from an outsider's perspective, is that a very activist investor has essentially threatened the company and told them that they need to become more like the big three if they want to continue to make profits, and kind of ignoring their own understanding of who their customers are. The Southwest customers, generally speaking, aren't the same as Delta, United, and American customers, and they don't expect it to be the same product. But as Southwest has made these major changes in the way it does business over the last 6, 8, 10 months, they're becoming more and more like a Delta, United, and American. And I think that potentially they're undermining their own strategy by not truly understanding the nature of the market that they're in and the place that they hold in that market.
Now, they end up losing because they're trying to force an issue based on their paradigm instead of asking themselves, really, what is the market doing? What does the customer want? Because they have an answer for the customer, just ask them. And the customer will like it. And I know, and we're going to make more money off it. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't work.
Time will tell on this one. Like I said, there's a few companies I've got my eye on that, may become poster children for us to discuss about other leadership opportunities or not so much opportunities.
So that really leads us into the next habit, because the next one, habit 6, is synergize. If I'm not listening properly, if I'm not seeking to understand, it's tough to synergize.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, the real crux of synergy to me is actually a word that has gained a pretty negative connotation over the last few years, and that is really diversity. But it's true diversity. It's diversity of thought. It's diversity of capability. It's how do we create the synergies amongst, all of these people, and how does this work with strategy in your organization? Well, I think it's twofold. Number one, I think you need to have enough diversity as you create your strategy, as you develop your strategic vision, to understand, to truly understand the market and the customer and the people that work for you, to make the best, most robust strategy that you have moving forward. But the second piece of that is understanding how to position yourself and your assets in order to create those synergies of effort inside your organization to most effectively and efficiently create your product or to serve your market. The thing that I always like to remind folks, because everyone says that, diversity is really the strength, create strength in things, which I say yes, but you have to add one caveat. The caveat of, diversity being strengthened is that's if everyone is moving the same direction. And the example that I use on that is on a football field. Do we want every single football player, the 11 guys out on offense, do we want them all to be 320-pound linemen? No, because, they wouldn't be able to beat the defensive backs, in a speed test down the field, or they wouldn't be able to throw the ball quite as far, or they wouldn't be able to run through the line. So there is a synergy between having, the big guys on the line, the small, fast guys as wide receivers, the bigger, fast guys as your running backs. However, if they're not all running on the same playbook, they're not going to be very successful, even with their diversity.
You want different qualities, characteristics, and abilities, but if those aren't all going same day, same way, if they're not all working together, those differences actually make it more complicated. And then your point about, have to have diversity of capabilities. Barry Sanders, perhaps one of the greatest running backs ever. You could say he's one of the greatest football players ever, but he was not a nose tackle for a reason. He was not an offensive guard for a reason. He would have been terrible at that. Terrible is probably a strong word, but he would not have been in the pros as a professional football player because he didn't have the right makeup. He didn't have the right skill set, but he was an amazing running back. And you can go through, every single skill position and find individuals that represent that exact thing who would not have been good in a lot of other positions, except for Bo Jackson. Jackson could have done everything.
Bo Jackson does everything. It's all good. That's why it's important, I think, to remember, though, that synergy in creating your strategy and your operations and all those other things is so important to being successful as a whole. And that leads into the last piece, which is the sharpen the saw. And that's probably one of the most misunderstood habits of Covey's 7 Habits. And I loved the way he explains it in the book. And so I'll just take this directly from the way he explained it. The way he explains how this is supposed to work is, he says, there was a man walking through the woods one day and he comes across a woodcutter. And the woodcutter's got a saw and the man is, busy going as fast as he can, as hard as he can, trying to saw through this giant log. And the observer watches the woodcutter for a number of minutes and realizes that he's not making much progress. And as he examines what's going on a little further, he finds out that the saw blade that the woodcutter is using is rather dull. And because it's so dull, he's not making any headway through the log. And so the observer remarks to the woodcutter, "Hey, man, if you would stop for a few minutes and sharpen that saw, you could cut through that log much quicker and you could get done with your job much, much faster." And the woodcutter's response was, "Nope, I got to get through this. I got to just keep going." And how many times do we see that as part of the strategy or as we're building strategy or trying to execute strategy of ignoring that idea of taking care of the resources that we're trying to use to make sure that those resources are the most efficient, the most sharp, the most effective to get done what we're trying to do?
I think it is one of the most misunderstood principles of Stephen Covey, and then really in general, because you have folks who are like, I need some me time, and their whole focus is how much time they go to the gym or they go on vacation. Or you have folks who say, I don't have time for me time. I don't have time for that. And as a result, they lack sleep. They're out of shape. They're overweight. They have poor health because they're not taking the time required to breathe and to sharpen that saw. So sharpening the saw cannot be your focus, but is a critical element of what you do. And translating that into an organization, I think that oftentimes organizations, when they start getting tight on budgets, they cut leadership training, they cut group exercise, they cut all that kind of stuff because they can't afford it. Well, the truth is they can't afford not to do it. They have to do that kind of a thing. They may have to change how they do it. They may have to change how they expend resources on it, but they have to do those kind of things if they want to keep their team focused and keep them effective across the rest of the spectrum. But whatever it is that they're doing, you have to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head there. What does sharpen the saw look like for a strategic organization, for a company? And that is, yes, you have to invest in training your people and continually looking for new and better ways to do things. It actually flows right straight into the commander's intent idea of debrief, of being able to debrief what's going on and understand so that you can become better. It's how do you continually make yourself, your individuals, your leaders, your managers, and your organization better? Because at the end of the day, the organizations that are more capable strategically thinking are those that are constantly improving and constantly moving forward in that process.
Yeah. Amen. All right. I've enjoyed this. I read Stephen Covey's book over 30 years ago, and I loved it then. I still love the principles. I think they really are timeless, and they apply to so much more than just you individually. And if you're not doing this, your ability to make good decisions, your ability to make the right decisions is going to be inhibited every single time. Thanks for joining me again, Rob. And we'll do this again. We'll talk about another topic next time. I'm not sure what, but we'll do it again. For anybody who has any questions, who hasn't read Stephen Covey's book, I recommend that you do read Stephen Covey's book. And if you want to have a further conversation, just reach out at www.askdereknow.com and we'll have that conversation. And if there's another topic similar to this that you want to talk about, we can go ahead and do that. Subscribe or follow and join us next time. Thanks for being here.
So that's it for today's episode of Commander's Intent Podcast. Head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or wherever you listen and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes will be entered in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 private exclusive leadership coaching package with Derek Oakes himself. So head on over to commandersintentpodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Derek's leadership guide and join us on the next episode.